Week 1 of 2024 fantasy football is in the books, but it doesn't mean that it's too late to go ahead and scope the trade market for the best potential buy low options as we approach week 2. So that's what we're going to do in this video. We're going to break down 10 players that I think you should buy low on before week 2 of 2024 fantasy football. Before we do so, let me remind you that Underdog Fantasy is the place to be if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season long. They've got their week 2 pick'ems already live before we head into Sunday's action. And if you are new to Underdog, you can claim a free pick'em Caleb Williams over half of a total yard to use going into Sunday's action. That's promo code the catch to claim that free pick'em. Use that and pair it with any other week 2 pick'em that you like as we approach Sunday. And while you're at it, you're going to get a 50% deposit match up to $1,000 on Underdog to use towards those pick'ems. That's up to $1,000 in bonus cash on Underdog, plus that free Caleb Williams over half a yard pick'em when you use promo code the catch. Let's break down what players we're going to try and trade for moving into week 2. All right, first on the list for today is going to be Amon-Ra St.Brown of the Detroit Lions. Now, I know a lot of you guys out there are going to be in more competitive leagues, maybe more serious leagues overall, and you're going to say, there's no way I can buy Amon-Ra St.Brown low. And if that is the case, then, well, it's probably still a good time to try and trade for him in general, coming off of that week 1 performance where he had less targets than Jameson Williams, just 3 receptions for 13 receiving yards and 4.3 total fantasy points. Moving into week 2, he gets the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who allowed the fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers in week 1, but I don't want to read too much into that because Jaden Daniels on the road running the football. I don't know. Washington Commanders, not really a lot of pass catching options. I think this Tampa Bay secondary will be a little bit weaker as the season goes on. But hey, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Tampa Bay just has a good secondary, and it's another tough home matchup for the Lions passing game in week 2. I guess we'll find out. But generally, just overall, if Amon-Ra St.Brown you're available to trade for at a lower cost in like a 10-man league, a lighter overall team format, maybe you're in a league with less bench spots than other leagues, Amon-Ra St.Brown's a very good target just coming off of that low ceiling performance in week 1, especially if he has another poor game in week 2. He's going to be a strong buy low candidate overall, but I do think he'll bounce back this week against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in a nice competitive game script. I think both secondaries going to be kind of weak throughout this game, so Amon-Ra St.Brown might depend on your league, your league mates, all of that stuff, but if you can go out and buy Amon-Ra St.Brown low, coming off of that 4.3 fantasy point performance in week 1, I absolutely think you need to do so, and I don't think I really need to explain why Amon-Ra St.Brown will be a great fantasy option as the season goes on. If you know that your league mate is panicked on Amon-Ra St.Brown, go out and hit the trade market right away. All right, next up, let's talk about another early round wide receiver. Not as early as Amon-Ra, but still a second rounder in a lot of drafts at worst, beginning the 3rd round wide receiver, and that's Chris Olave of the New Orleans Saints. And this is another early round wide receiver who performed poorly in week 1. 3.1 fantasy points, just 2 targets, 2 receptions. And I talked a lot about this going into week 1. The Carolina Panthers were actually a top 5 unit against opposing wide receivers last year. And I said, well, I don't think this is going to be a great day for the Panthers. Might not be a great day for Chris Olave in week 1. And overall, I mean, it actually wasn't a very good day for the Saints wide receivers as a whole at home against the Panthers. I know Rashid Shaheed had the big touchdown play, but you take that away, he really did close to nothing and only had 3 total receptions. The Panthers just get destroyed on the ground, and that also impacts them giving up less fantasy points to wide receivers because they're giving up so many fantasy points to running backs. But here in week 2 at Dallas, it's once again not a fantastic matchup, but that kind of helps, the potential to buy Chris Olave low, because I think opposing fantasy managers look at things and say, oh, it's maybe another bad matchup here in week 2 for the time being in this short window. Maybe Olave is not great, so you can go out and offer the right offer to go ahead and snag Chris Olave, who's still going to be very productive on the season, is still the true wide receiver 1 for the New Orleans Saints, who does have some more attractive matchups, including right away in week 3, Philadelphia Eagles secondary coming up. So Olave's out there. I think he's a fantastic buy low candidate for week 2. I think a lot of people are targeting Chris Olave as a top buy low candidate overall. He's a great wide receiver 1 to go ahead and try and add to your roster before it's too late. All right, third wide receiver we're going to talk about, and I will note there are a lot of veteran wide receivers in week 1 that underperformed. I mean, guys like DJ Moore, Terry McLaurin, Amari Cooper, Christian Kirk, all kinds of names that I think are strong buy low candidates, but I think the 3 guys in today's videos are kind of top priority. And that brings us to Brandon Aiyuk, who will get the Minnesota Vikings in week 2 after a really bad performance in week 1 overall against the New York Jets at home. For the most part, had Sauce Gardner in this game. We all know Aiyuk obviously missed training camp, and it kind of showed on that Monday night matchup. 5 targets, 2 receptions, 28 receiving yards. Dropped, the touchdown pass, a great throw from Purdy. All of that stuff, I still think Aiyuk's going to be fine. We'll get the Vikings in week 2, then the Rams in week 3. Then the Patriots in week 4. So it's like not a bad stretch here, but certainly not a great stretch if we're looking at week 1's data. But then in week 5, we'll get the Arizona Cardinals and the Seattle Seahawks, and be at home against the Chiefs and the Cowboys. So, even while some of those aren't great matchups per se, they're good game scripts that will allow for fantasy points overall. But, Brandon Aiyuk is going to be just fine. He's got to get that rust off. Was still the wide receiver 14 last year in full PPR, still on a fantastic offense and a great system. A lot of people, I think, worried about Aiyuk after that week 1 performance. Like, what is Brandon Aiyuk going to be this year? Like, how much did him missing training camp, and is that going to end up impacting his entire season, all that stuff? But Aiyuk's going to be fine. He's on the Niners. Great system, great offense. He is definitely a very strong buy low candidate after that week 1 performance and as we approach week 2. All right, moving along to the running back position, I want to talk about Brian Robinson Jr., who had a really solid week 1 against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers defense with 17.9 fantasy points, 40 yards on the ground, a touchdown, and added 3 receptions for 49 receiving yards in week 1. A lot of people looked at that week 1 matchup, and Tampa Bay, was a strong defensive unit against running backs in fantasy football last year, and he still came out of this game with nearly 18 fantasy points, got involved in the passing game. And I think the important thing here is you have some fantasy managers kind of worried about Brian Robinson Jr. because Jaden Daniels ran for 88 rushing yards in week 1, and we're certainly probably going to see Jaden Daniels continue to ramp up that rushing ability. But then the day, in this Cliff Kingsbury offense, they want to run the football, and Brian Robinson Jr. is the clear-cut RB1 here. Austin Eckler just 2 touches on the ground. He did have 4 targets, 4 receptions, but game script also, I think, helped Austin Eckler in week 1. We'll see how much, involvement he gets in the coming weeks, but 12 touches for Brian Robinson Jr. He's the running back that they want to use as a workhorse running back. And, I know, looking out at a player coming off of a strong performance, 17.9 points, might be hard to potentially buy him low, but where, a lot of fantasy managers drafted him, he's an RB3 or RB4, which presents a good trade opportunity for you guys. Plus, I think now is the time to trade for Brian Robinson because he gets the Giants in week 2, the Bengals in week 3, the Cardinals in week 4. Going to be a really strong stretch the next 3 weeks here in the early part of the season. And then he'll get the Browns and the Ravens a little bit tougher, but then he gets the Panthers in week 7. We'll get the Giants again in week 9. He's going to have some really strong performances throughout the season. I think he's an absolute great running back to go ahead and target, try to buy him low, because I just don't know if you're going to be able to buy him low over the next couple of weeks against those poor run defenses. Go out and get him on your rosters. I think he's going to be a solid fantasy option all season long, but the window here I think might be short to buy Brian Robinson Jr. low. All right, next up is Jerome Ford of the Cleveland Browns came out of week one, once again, with 18.9 fantasy points, 7 targets, 6 receptions, 25 receiving yards. Was really nice to see, but also was the true workhorse running back. I mean, this is a similar situation to Brian Robinson Jr. For the Cleveland Browns in week one. 12 touches on the ground. Pierre Strong had 2. Nobody else, no other running backs on this team had any touches on the ground other than those 2 guys in week one, and Jerome Ford had 12 total touches. The volume's going to be here for Jerome Ford until further notice, and I think there's 2 things here that make him a really good buy low candidate. The first thing is we look at this Browns offense, everything looks bad. Deshaun Watson looks bad, the play calling, I mean, just this is kind of a team offensively in shambles that's scaring away a lot of fantasy managers. So while maybe, a fantasy manager likes Jerome Ford or where they drafted Jerome Ford and him being a depth piece, they probably don't have the confidence in the Browns offense as a whole. So I think that presents a good buy low opportunity. And I mean, on top of that, right, like I just said, he is an RB4 for a lot of fantasy managers, which in itself is helpful in those trade negotiations. But I think on top of that, you probably are going to see Nick Chubb rushing back to be out on the field with the way this offense looked in week one. Maybe that changes in the next couple of weeks and this offense looks different. But as long as his offense and Deshaun Watson look how they did in week one, I don't think Nick Chubb's, I think he's going to be taking his time nursing back from that injury he suffered last year. But on top of all of that, in the next coming weeks, we have the Jacksonville Jaguars, the Giants, the Raiders, the Commanders, Philadelphia, and then the Cincinnati Bengals. So this is a really strong stretch for the running back position and for Jerome Ford. And I think he'll be the RB1 through all of those coming weeks. So I think it's a really, small window once again to go out and get Jerome Ford. And I think he's going to be very consistent in fantasy football over the next couple weeks. And I'm not too worried about Nick Chubb's return. I think they're going to ease Nick Chubb in. And once again, I just don't think Nick Chubb's going to be going out of his way to get back on the field with this offense. So Jerome Ford, a great buy low candidate. And once again, there's a small window here because these upcoming matchups are very strong for the running back position. All right, last running back I want to talk about is Tony Pollard, who will face the Jets in week 2. Once again, a solid week 1 performance out of a running back here, 18.4 fantasy points, 82 yards on the ground, a touchdown, 5.1 yards per carry, and 3 total receptions. This is another running back with a small trade window. He'll get the Jets in week 2. That Jets defense, I mean, I know we think about it and we think just nothing but good things, but they are not good against the run. They were not good against the run last year, and they did not look good against the run in week 1. Then in week 3, he gets the Green Bay Packers. He got torched by Saquon Barkley in week 1. Then in week 4, the Miami Dolphins, who at the time of recording this just got torched by James Cook last night. And overall, even through week 1, did not look good in terms of their run defense. So at the end of the day, Tony Pollard, I think a small window here, and I think it might be a little bit more difficult to trade for Pollard, but I think the primary thing is you still have some fantasy managers who are looking at Pollard and still thinking about Tajay Spears, maybe potentially getting more touches as the season goes on. He just 4 touches in week 1, but did have 4 targets, 4 receptions in week 1 as well. So I think that kind of helps. Plus, once again, Pollard was a later round running back. So if you're looking at, across your league and your league mate has 3 or 4 running backs in front of Tony Pollard, that's certainly going to help when it comes to those trade negotiations. So I like Tony Pollard. I think, in my opinion, he's looking like the clear-cut RB1 for the Tennessee Titans. And then you've got Tajay Spears kind of coming in as like a third down receiving back. And I think the other aspect here to kind of talk about is that Will Levis looked awful in week 1. This offense is a big question mark right now, but I think that's okay for Tony Pollard because they're going to rely on Tony Pollard and this run game as the season goes on, which is another reason why I think you should go out and trade for him. And I mean, the Titans have a bye week in week 5 after that stretch we just talked about, but right out of the bye, they get the Colts and the Bills, 2 teams who have thus far through the season struggled against the run. So once again, I think this is a small window. I think all 3 of these running backs we talked about in the video, small window to trade for. They all have solid matchups coming up. Go buy low on these running backs right now. And moving on to the tight end position, let's talk about Jake Ferguson, who left week 1's action with a knee injury, and then it was looking like he was going to miss some time. And now it's looking like he's not going to miss some time. And I think this is the main reason you should go trade for him now. Ferguson was one of my favorite tight ends coming into the season. And I think week one, that might kind of change for some fantasy managers because they're looking at him now and they're saying, oh, like he's hurt. Is he not hurt? How bad is this? How serious is this? Can I trust starting him? If you can trade for him, buy him low, especially if you're in a position where you don't have to start him right away. I still think he's going to be very productive in fantasy football this season. So the injury presents that kind of buy low opportunity. Still had 5 targets in week one, which is good to see. I know he only had 3 receptions, 15 receiving yards, but the target share was there until he had to leave the game. This is still a tight end that Dak Prescott trusts is going to be a big part of this offense when he is healthy. And on top of that, I don't know if he's going to have a great week two. He's playing the New Orleans Saints, so I don't think this is necessarily a tight end that you need to trade for and start in week two. Saints gave up the second fewest fantasy points to tight ends in week one. But I think that once again helps the buy low opportunity. Coming off of an injury that made him leave week one, then a tough matchup in week two. It's a thin position. If week one is any indication of what we're going to get a tight end this year, it's a thin position right now. And I think that makes Jake Ferguson a massive buy low candidate for the week. Go out and target him while that injury is still up in the air. All right, next up, I want to talk about Isiah Likely, who doesn't really seem like a buy low candidate after scoring 26 fantasy points in week one. But I've gotten a lot of trade questions. We get a ton of trade questions here at the channel. And the reason I want to talk about Isiah Likely is because I've seen a lot of rosters where some of you guys are like, I have Evan Ingram, Dalton Schultz, and Isiah Likely, or I have Trey McBride, Evan Ingram, and Isiah Likely. And you're like, what do I do? How do I flip Isiah Likely? How do I trade Isiah Likely? Or people are literally just like, I have Sam Laporta and Isiah Likely. I picked up Isiah Likely on the waiver wire, or I spent half my free agent bidding on Isiah Likely just so I could trade him. So I think a lot of people want to trade Isiah Likely, but I don't know how aggressive the trade market really is for Isiah Likely because he's still a tight end at the end of the day. So there are definitely some teams that I think would pay more and kind of buy him high. But I do think there's across leagues out there right now, a lot of good buy low opportunities on Isiah Likely, especially if you're seeing, a league mate who owns him trying to trade him and nobody's really biting. So I think this could end up being a unique, opportunity to go out and buy a tight end who I still think is going to be very productive throughout this season. Yes, I think Mark Andrews is going to be just fine. I think Isiah Likely is still the tight end 2 here, but I'm in on the Isiah Likely hype personally. Just looked so good with the ball in his hands. Was very productive last year when Mark Andrews was out at the end of the year. So I think the Ravens are going to continue to find ways to get Isiah Likely the football, especially when you look at the fact that, in terms of pass catchers on the Ravens right now, it's basically Zay Flowers, Mark Andrews, Justice Hill, and Isiah Likely, probably maybe potentially in front of Justice Hill and Mark Andrews. So maybe rookie Devontae Walker, who didn't play week one, and Nelson Aguilar can muster up something. But mainly at the end of the day, I think they have to get Isiah Likely the football. So if you are in a spot where you can buy Isiah Likely low, especially if you're looking at, your league mate who owns him and they don't really need him, I think you should absolutely go out and take advantage of it now while you can, because I do think he's going to be very productive as the season goes on. All right, let's talk about 2 quarterbacks very quickly. Dak Prescott finished week one as the quarterback 22 against the Cleveland Browns on the road, 179 passing yards, a passing touchdown, 19 of 32, no interceptions, had a fumble, it was recovered, was sacked 3 times, and had 1 rushing attempt for 3 rushing yards. Not good numbers. I think the main reason to go out and buy Dak Prescott low is because he's still going to have a good season, still going to be a viable quarterback. And now, after looking at week one with Jordan Love going down for a few weeks, Tua going to miss time as well, probably in a spot where some of you guys may need a quarterback. A lot of people who drafted Dak drafted a second quarterback because you drafted Dak Prescott so late. So especially if you're looking at teams in single quarterback leagues where, if you have a fantasy owner drafted like Dak Prescott and Jaden Daniels, they're going to be willing to sell Dak Prescott low because of the week one that Jaden Daniels had and the upside that he's presenting, But even, teams that went out and drafted Dak Prescott and Matthew Stafford and, Dak Prescott and Brock Purdy, things like that. It just, after this poor week 1 performance, it presents a unique opportunity to go out and get a quarterback who's still going to be very good this season. Gets the Saints in week 2, another tough matchup here, but once again, that can help in terms of buying a player low, because it looks like for this short window, things aren't going to be so great, at least through week 2. And he gets the Ravens, the Giants, the Steelers, the Lions, a bye week, then the Niners. But what I'm mainly looking at is towards the end of the season. Starting in week 12, he has Washington, the Giants, the Bengals, the Panthers, the Buccaneers, and the Eagles, a really good stretch heading into the fantasy playoffs. Then even before that, some of these games, week 11 at the Texans, week 10 at the Eagles, week 8 at the Niners, they still allow for good game scripts, which even if the defenses are playing well, sometimes it's okay because there's just points being scored and it's a competitive game script at the end of the day. So I think Prescott's going to be fine. He might not finish as a QB3 like he did last year, but I think top 10, top 12 range is certainly in line for Dak Prescott, no doubt about it. So you can go out and buy him low. You're needy at the quarterback position. I think he's a very strong candidate moving into week 2. All right, last but not least, we just mentioned him. Let's talk about Jordan Love. So I think Jordan Love is going to be very good this year. It was really high on Jordan Love going into the season. We know he's going to miss some time here. We don't know exactly how long it's going to be, but at least we have had positive progression in terms of the injury news since he suffered that knee injury in week 1's Friday night game. And I think that this is the whole reason to go out and buy him low, is because he's dealing with the injury. It feels like a roster clogger. The Packers aren't going to place him on IR, so it's affecting fantasy managers because you can't put him in the IR spot, but you certainly can't start him. I mean, technically he's listed as doubtful for the coming week, but I think for sure he's not playing in week 2 against the Colts. But once Jordan Love is back, once he's healthy, we saw, the capability that he's going to have through the entire fantasy season. And while the ceiling wasn't incredibly high in week 1, if he's giving you 17 to 18 fantasy points as a floor on a weekly basis, that's still very, very good. Packers offense going to be very good when Jordan Love is healthy. We know he has tons of young, dynamic playmakers on this offense. So the injury itself presents the buy low opportunity. If you are in a good spot at quarterback, maybe you have a guy who's maybe a little bit more volatile, like Anthony Richardson, potentially Jaden Daniels, Kyler Murray, players who run the football a little bit more, or maybe you just weren't happy with your week 1 performance out of the quarterback position. With a player maybe like Patrick Mahomes, he only put up 16 fantasy points. Maybe you're coming off of a week 2 performance with Josh Allen where he didn't give you a lot of fantasy points, which is game script oriented. Josh Allen's going to be fine. But, whatever it may be, I think Jordan Love is just a great quarterback that you can go out and trade for and probably don't have to give up nearly as much as you did going into week 1. So Jordan Love's out there. You're in need of a quarterback. You feel like you want an additional kind of upside piece at quarterback. I think he's a great buy low opportunity moving into week 2. That'll do it for today's video. Don't forget, if you guys have any fantasy football questions, be sure to drop them down below. I will answer every comment, every fantasy question on this video before Sunday's action. Don't forget, we have everything that you guys need for week 2 fantasy football on the channel. Start sits at wide receivers, running backs, quarterbacks, tight ends, must start running backs and wide receivers, waiver wire options, must start defenses, must start kickers, whatever you guys need, we've got it. So go check out the videos on the channel. They'll be popping up on the screen here at some point. And if you guys did enjoy the content or find it helpful, be sure to hit that subscribe button on the way out. And with that, I will say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.